Hello friends, my name's Ty, and I'm going to read to you. This is a story called Those Who Stand that I wrote for a contest a number of years ago, and I hope you like it. The crowded tavern fell silent as a swordsman stood and glared at the man across the table. "You mock me?" the swordsman asked, his hand slowly moving towards the pommel of his sword. "I was once the keenest blade in the 4 cities, the king's own champion. And I won't take the likes of you pits." And he tried to whip the blade from the sheath, but the crossguard caught on the edge of the table. The swordsman cursed and tried all the harder to wrest his sword clear of the scabbard, but tripped over the chair behind him and fell on his ass. The impact of his heavy body was punctuated by a wet belch jarring loose by his landing. A roar of laughter erupted from the ragged occupants of the tavern. "The king's champion, indeed," the gap-toothed man across the table said, slapping the rough surface of the table and shaking with mirth. "When was the last time you fought a duel, Tyam?" "He fights the bottle every night," another leering face cackled. "Aye," the gap-toothed man said, "and he loses." Tyam stood slowly, stumbling again as his sword tangled in his legs, drawing a fresh burst of laughter from the surrounding audience. He dusted himself off and wiped at his face. "I once sat at the king's table. I need not trouble myself with the likes of you," he said, and stuck his red nose in the air. There were a few chuckles this time, but hardly anyone was listening. Most turned back to their cups and small conversations. He was hardly even fit to be a laughingstock anymore. With as much dignity as he could manage, covered in spilled wine and moldy sawdust, Tyam steadied himself and walked towards the door. The night air kissed his face with frosty lips as he stepped out of the reeking warmth of the tavern into the cobbled street. He took a deep, sobering breath and rubbed his stubbled chin. He took his hand from his face, looking down at it, and made it into a trembling fist. It had been steady once, steady and hard, and quicker than any to be found. That hand had drawn steel in almost 100 duels in his time as a king's champion, and many more in campaigns he'd served in. But those days of steady steel had been lost to drink and disregard, and the only glory he found now was in stories told in smoky taverns, trading his memories for another jug of cheap wine. "Tyam Cole," a voice said from behind him. Tyam turned, a little more steady in the cold air, and dropped his hand to his sword. "Aye, who asks?" An unassuming man, dressed in a long blue cloak, stepped into the light from one of the tavern's dirty windows. He wore an easy smile of recognition and reached out a small hand towards Tyam. The swordsman looked down at the offered hand suspiciously, then slowly took his own hand off the grip of his sword and clasped with the small man. "I saw you stand in the ring against the champion of one of the southern kingdoms. A giant he was," the blue-cloaked man said and released Tyam's hand. "What, 6 years ago?" Tyam withdrew his hand and looked down at it. 7, he said softly. "Aye, was it?" The small man folded his arms across his narrow chest and looked at Tyam, his young face open and friendly. "How the years forget away from us, eh?" Tyam willed his hand to stop shaking. "How indeed." "What have you been doing with yourself since then? Still dueling?" Tyam looked up at the man and cleared his throat. No, I've taken a position as a, he looked back at the tavern, as an entertainer." The small man looked behind him at the front of the haven. His open face turned down in a praising frown. "Have you?" He turned back to face Tyam. Ever given thought to fighting again?" Tyam looked back at his still trembling hand. "Every now and then." "What would you say if you were offered a position as champion once again, for good pay, and one duel only?" Tyam looked up and the thin man was no longer smiling. His face was hard as he watched the swordsman. "And what did you say your name was, sir?" "I didn't, but you and I have met before." Tyam narrowed his eyes, squinting through the wine-induced haze, and peered at the man before him. "I do know you," he said. "I've seen you at court." Tyam stopped squinting. "You're Dorn Griffin, a court mage." "Aye," Dorn said, a slight grin keeping onto his face. apparently pleased at being recognized. "I was but an apprentice, serving the king's chief advisor when I last saw you fight." "You were," Thyam said, nodding. "You still serve the king?" Dorn shrugged. "I am not at court, but I serve the king in my own way through other opportunities." "And these opportunities require a champion, do they?" "This day they do." Thyam nodded and looked down at his hand again. "When would the duel take place?" "Tonight. Now. The battle only awaits our arrival." He knew he was a drunken fool, but Thyam was not a complete idiot. "What does a mage need a swordsman for? And why me? We both know my best days are well behind me. Why would you seek me out here? This is no chance meeting, is it?" "You're a very astute man, Thyam," Dorn said, and grinned. "I may have had some inclination you were here." "Aye. And why did you come?" The mage bit his bottom lip. "There is a prize I seek. Something that needs to be fought for. I've sought out others, and they prove to be easily daunted. I need a man who will stick to the course, who will stand to the task." "And you figure a used-up drunk will meet muster?" "I've seen you fight, and I know your skill. Your reputation touts you as a man who never flees. I heard a story about you holding the line against a dozen men in the Northern Wars. I need a man with that kind of sand." "What if all my sand has passed through the time glass of my life and there's not left in me but dust?" "Now is your chance to find out." Thyam looked down at his hand again. Despite his will, it shook, unruly as a spoiled child. He needed to see it steady again. "Aye, a good chance it is. Lead on, mage." Dorn led the way through the cold night, Thyam a step behind. The swordsman flexed his trembling hand as he walked. "You keep looking at your hand," Dorn said. "Is it paining you?" Thyam shrugged. "Not overly. Sometimes memories of things sting worse than any wound." "Was it a memory that drove you from the king's service?" "No, it was the king drove me from the king's service. It were a memory that drove me to the nearest alehouse. The last 3 duels I fought were under a cloud of honeyed wine. I've been told stories of them, but I don't remember a single moment of my own." Dorn said nothing for several paces, then turned his head and looked at Thyam. "What memory could bend a man so?" Thyam moved to wave the young mage off, but stopped when his still shaking hand passed before his eyes. For these many years he's worn his memories like a lead cloak, dragging his shoulders ever closer to the ground. If there really were a chance to go back and reclaim a piece of who he was, it would best begin with a shedding of that weight. 8 years ago, Thyam said. The king sought to conquer a small border province in the deep south. As is the custom, he gave them opportunity for single combat to avoid a slaughter. Their own custom was to have the eldest son of their king fight any duel that decided the fate of their realm. He looked down at his hand. The son of the king was 15 years old, and that boy took up his father's sword and met me in the ring like the man he would never become. I asked the king for leniency, but he was a hungry man then, and wanted that boy's lands with a deep lust. Ever the loyal man, I stepped into the ring, slapped the brave boy's sword aside like it was made of parchment, and ran him through. When that boy fell, his blood was on this hand. Thyam held up his trembling sword hand. And in these 8 years, I've never been able to wash it off. Dorn looked down. Bring that hand into the light, and perhaps the blood will fade. Thyam shrugged. Perhaps it will. Dorn glanced up at the moon. We have to hurry. Our time is growing short. He turned and hurried into the night, and Thyam followed, flexing his hand as he went. The mage led a twisting route through the back ways of the city, until they finally came to a stop before a small door in the side of what looked like a brickmaker's hut. Dorn checked over his shoulder before laying his knuckles on the door. A small slot clicked open, a narrow shaft of light, and a pair of eyes appeared. They passed over at Dorn, then stopped on Thyam. Your new champion? A voice below the eyes asked. Dorn nodded. The slot snapped shut and the door swung open. A broad man in armor, with a sword in one hip and a flare-headed mace in the other, stood to the side of the door, his face blank. Beyond him was a narrow staircase leading down. Dorn passed the man quickly, not glancing at him. Thyam went more slowly, watching the guard for signs of treachery. The guard grinned and nodded. "Die with honor, swordsman." Thyam scowled. "I thank you for your high regard." The guard smirked. "In this place, honor is a high regard." The staircase was long, and it went down deeper than Thyam would have thought possible from looking at the exterior of the hut. There were torches set in recessed brackets in the walls, and the light from the top of the stairs had almost disappeared by the time they reached the next torch. The bottom of the stairs leveled off into a slightly broader hallway, and Thyam could see light at the end of it. His left hand sat on the pommel of his sword, some of his old instinct and habit returning to him as he followed Dorn towards the light. When they neared the lighted opening, a noise reached Thyam's ears. A dull buzz at first, but growing more distinct as they walked until the swordman could make out individual voices, all of them angry. As they stepped into the light and the noise, Thyam felt his mouth fall open. The space he found himself in was huge, the ceiling outreaching the light from the torches in the walls. Below the torches, rows of stone seats lined the rounded walls, except for the broad opening in front of where Thyam stood. It was a kind of place vitally familiar to Thyam. It was a battleground. It was a ring. Inside the ring stood a man, big as any Thyam had ever seen. He wore a vest of mail and had thick plates covering his shoulders and forearms. He stood with a bearded axe on his shoulder, and the arm holding it was thick with corded muscle. His hair was short and ragged, his face scarred, and he stood looking at a dead man at his feet. The crowd around him was a motley assortment of people, most of them screaming and savage, reveling in the carnage in the ring below. On Thyam's right, a knot of men and women in blue cloaks identical to Dorn's filled several seats, and a lot of them turned to regard Dorn and Thyam as they entered. Across from Thyam, past the shoulder of the huge man, was a narrow steel cage, and in the cage was a small girl. It was much like the rings of Thyam's previous life, but there was no honor here, much as the guard had warned. There was no ceremony or order. There was only a mob of people screaming for the blood of the fallen. "What manor have you brought me to, mage?" Thyam asked in a low voice, barely audible among the howling. Dorn looked at him. "A place where you were vitally needed, swordsman." "Dorn Griffin, you've brought another of your fools to die, I see." The speaker, a slender man wearing a grey silken robe, stepped around the man with the axe and stood regarding Dorn with his arms folded. "Well, bring him on then. Cast will be happy to meet him." "Jalen," Dorn replied with a terse nod, the greeting absent of warmth. "You're down to your last chance, Dorn," the man called Jalen said, in a confident smirk on his face. "Once this man is dead, the girl is mine." "Aye, but if my man wins, she leaves with us." "That is an if I would not count on, were I you." "Where did you find this one? He looks like he's been sleeping in a wine cask. Can't you and yours come up with someone who can actually fight?" "Life is full of surprises, Jalen, and you're about to get one." "We shall see," Jalen said, and sneered at Thyam. "Prepare your man. Let's get this over with." Jalen turned and walked to the edge of the ring at Thyam's left, approaching a knot of people dressed in similar grey silk. The man with the axe gave Thyam an appraising look, showed an awful grin, and turned to follow. Dorn walked briskly over to where the other blue-cloaked people sat, and Thyam followed, looking around nervously. The other blue cloaks eyed Thyam skeptically. "Is this the best you could find, Dorn?" a dark-haired woman with blue eyes asked, leaning forward in her seat. "You know what is at stake here." Dorn gave her a hard look. "I know better than you comprehend what is at stake here, Vilna. We will do well with this man. He was once the champion of the king." A grey-bearded man sitting next to the woman snorted. "He now looks to be champion of the winemakers." Thyam grabbed Dorn's narrow arm. "What is happening here, mage?" He pointed across the ring at the man with the axe. "Is that who I am to fight?" Dorn looked at him, his face placid. "Aye, it is. You are our champion, and he is theirs." Thyam felt distinctly ill, and desperately wanted a drink. "What are we fighting for?" Dorn tilted his chin towards the girl in the cage. "We fight for her." Time looked over at the girl, a tiny wisp of a thing, barely more than a child. "For her? Why?" Dorn sighed. "To explain what is at work here would take far more time than we have, Time. In short, that girl," he pointed to the cage, "is very special. Jalen's people have laid claim to her, and I have challenged them. The rules of our order give me 3 chances, 3 instances of single combat to beat their champion and claim the girl. You are the 3rd of those chances." He looked away from Time's face and at the girl. "If we win, she will be nurtured and guided and will do great things. If they win, she will be used and die. That, Time, is why we fight for her." Time found himself shaking his head and backing away. He'd willingly fought for the fates of countries and thousands of men that defended them, at the will of one of the most powerful men in the world. But this fight, for the fate of a single girl and the importance Dorn attributed to her against a monstrous opponent, the likes of which he'd never seen, was too much for Time. For the first time in his life, he was deeply and horribly afraid. "I am not the man for this, Dorn," Time said, taking another step backwards. "You have not chosen well. This fight will end in my death and hers. You must find another." "There is no other," Dorn said, and took an urgent step towards him while Time retreated further, as though through distance he could deny the mage's need. "There is no other champion but you. If we do not win her before the moon sets, our challenge is forfeit and Jalen claims the girl." Time looked at the ground, retreating further, until the backs of his knees struck the edge of a bench and he sat down heavily on it. "I am not the man for this." "Ha!" barked a laugh from across the ring. "Your champion folds, Dorn." Time lifted his head and saw Jalen pointing at him. "He falls like a rotten tree. This facade is over. The girl is mine." Dorn took 2 steps into the ring and looked at Time. The swordsman found he could not meet the mage's gaze, and looked at his boots while his hands dangled over his knees. He looked at his sword hand and saw it was still shaking. Dorn looked at the assembled crowd, desperation on his face. "We all know if Jalen claims a child, it is nigh a death sentence. Is there no one who will act as her champion?" There was no response to Dorn's plea but more screaming. Time sat, fear holding with a cheer, merciless grip. Behind the fear, waiting its turn to ravage him, was a deep and horrific shame. He wanted to flee this place, but his legs wouldn't lift him up. Worse, he wanted a drink. He wanted to find an ale shop, pawn the sword he kept all these years after all his other possessions were gone, and drink himself to death. "Are you sick?" a small voice asked from Time's left. The swordsman rubbed a rough hand over his oily face and turned his head. He found himself looking into the eyes of the captive child, his shambling flight from Dorn carrying him to the seat next to her cage. "What?" he asked. "Your hands are shaking. Are you sick?" No, Time said, regarding her through his blurred vision. "I'm not sick. Just scared, I guess." The girl nodded as though she understood. "I'm scared too. I don't like this place and I want to go home." "Do you think they'll let me go home?" Time shook his head. I don't know." The girl pressed her lips into a thin line, and her chin trembled a moment. Then she reached out a small hand. "My mother told me, when I was scared, to hold the hand of a friend. Do you want to hold my hand? Maybe then we won't be scared anymore." Time, in the face of the child's courage, a courage like that shown by the boy he'd killed, could not refuse her. Slowly, he reached out his trembling sword hand, and the girl grasped it firmly. He looked into her small face, and she smiled gratefully, and gripped his hand all the tighter. When he looked down at his sword hand, he found it was no longer shaking. Dorn was still circling the ring, looking at the crowd. "Is there no one here?" he shouted, desperate. "Is there no one who will stand?" "I will," Time said, still looking into the face of the child. Dorn stopped his circling. "What?" he asked, turning. "I will stand for her," Time said, his voice stronger this time. He came to his feet, still holding the girl's hand, and looked over at Jalen and the man with the axe. I will stand for this child. He looked down at the girl. You will see home again. She smiled up at him. Tears bloomed in the corners of her eyes. He smiled back, his jaw tight, squeezed her hand, and stepped into the ring. Dorn stepped to meet him. A change of heart, Thyam? The mage's face was flat and serious. Thyam shrugged. Not so much a change as a finding of it. Dorn grinned. Then the god smiled on us. He looked over his blue shoulder at Jalen, who did not look pleased at Thyam's resolution. These are dark days, and someone must stand. He looked back at Thyam. Are you ready? Thyam looked down at his sword hand. It was still. As ready as I can be. The mage nodded, then turned and faced Jalen. I, Dorn Griffin, Archmage of the Blue Square, issue challenge to Jalen of the Grey Square for the life of this child. He pointed to the girl. You have no right to her, and we will not stand by while you tear her life away. We stand against you and your black work, against your evil. I present our champion, Thyam Cole. Thyam, accustomed to the pomp of a formal dueling challenge, stepped forward and drew his sword. The reliable weight of it was welcome in his hand. The bright steel, kept polished and sharp even through his drunkest days, reflected the dim light of the torches. In a duel for the king, he would salute his opponent, but he had an inkling the gesture would be wasted on the man across from him. Jalen took 2 swaggering, arrogant steps towards Dorn. I, Jalen Park, Archmage of the Grey Square, accept your pitiful challenge. We have claimed this girl because she is ours for the claiming, taken by right of strength, and will not give her up to you and the likes of your mock champion. I present a real warrior. Cast. Jalen smirked and turned his eyes to Thyam. He will be the end of you. The armored giant stepped forward, lifted his axe above his head, and roared at the crowd, spittle flying from his open mouth. The crowd roared back with equal enthusiasm. He turned towards Thyam, his teeth bared in a snarl, and spat at the swordsman's feet. Thyam looked down at the gob, unimpressed. Gestures of discourtesy and bravado were a mask of the amateur, and he had no need of them. Jalen gave his snarl of his own. On your word, then, challenger. Thyam took up his stance, sword held up, point towards his opponent, and nodded at Cast. My word is now. The giant, filled with raw aggression and barbarian strength, wasted no time and charged at Thyam with a howl, swinging his axe in a downward arc at the top of the swordsman's head. Thyam was well aware he was not the fighter he was 10 years ago, and his body would not respond like it once did, but the skill, the timing, the knowledge still remained. He pivoted smoothly on his lead foot, and the axe passed through where his head had once been and hit the stone floor with a jarring clang. Thyam continued his turn, rolling past his opponent's charge and slashed downwards. Cast was quick for all his massive size, but Thyam's sword point still caught the flesh of his lower leg and sliced a thin hole through the leg of his filthy trousers. Cast turned, his face twisted and bared his teeth. He looked down at the slowly spreading red stain in his leg, then threw back his head and laughed. He lifted his leg, dug his fingers into the wound, then rubbed the blood on his face. Your little weapon makes little cuts, Cast snarled, then sucked at one finger. Only the first of many, Thyam said, and took up his stance. Cast lifted his axe again, holding it over his shoulder like a woodsman preparing to split a log, and slid forward, cautiously this time. He lunged, and Thyam pivoted out of the way again, but the giant, only making a feint, changed direction, lowered his shoulder, and slammed into Thyam. The swordsman was tossed bodily in the air, lights flashing in his vision as he struck the stone floor with a jarring impact. He struggled, dazed, to come to his feet, but he heard Cast roar coming fast upon him. Thyam managed to get to his knees as the giant reached him, and Cast swung his axe sideways like a farmer scything wheat. Thyam threw himself flat and rolled clumsily, managing to avoid the whistling blade. He scrambled to his feet, coming up in his crouch, sword held ready. His mouth was filling with blood, and he spat, and a piece of tooth clattered off the ground. Cast bent down and picked up the broken-off molar, then stuck it behind his broad leather belt. Something to remember you by. When you're dead. Time didn't dare risk replying. He was already winded from the fight, and it took all his will not to open his mouth and pant like a dog. Speech would only give him away. Cass began circling, a grin on his scarred face, and Time circled with him. As he stepped, Time cursed himself for his years of sloth and drink, and looked for a way to bring down the giant before his legs grew watery and he fell down from exhaustion. Time feinted, lunging to the left, reaching out with his sword to poke at Cass. The giant deflected Tiam's jab with the haft of his axe, but the swordsman whipped his thin blade to the other side of Cass' body and scored a small nick on his shoulder, below his armor. Tiam lunged again, leaping to the other side and poked downwards, jabbing at Cass' knee. The big man tried to shuffle out of the way and counter, but Tiam had already moved, his feet sliding smoothly across the floor, never seeming to set down. Tiam continued forwards, making small feints and jabs, poking and prodding, opening small cuts on the giant wherever he could get to the man's defenses. Cass quickly grew frustrated at Tiam's continued assault, letting out growls of frustration, rather than pain, whenever he was cut. It took all of Tiam's strength to keep moving. His mouth was now hanging open, his breath ragged, while his legs and his chest burned with the effort. The light sword in his hand felt like an ironwood log, and he quietly wondered how many more times he could lift it before it fell from his grip. Tiam gave one last lunge, then dropped his guard, ceasing his attacks and letting Cass believe he was finished. The giant's assumption would not be far from the truth, and Tiam knew he had the strength for a single strike. If it failed, then so did he. Cass' eyes lit up as Tiam hunched forward, panting, and the giant stopped his retreat, let out a roar, and lifted his axe high as he charged. Tiam waited, his experience keeping him from flinching, until Cass was almost on top of him. As the giant bore down, the swordsman reached forward, his left leg lunging while his sword hand streaked out. Tiam's thin blade punched through the mail links at the center of Cass' chest, and the sword slid in smoothly, right down to the basket hilt. Tiam leaned left and let the momentum of his lunge carry him in a tumble across the floor. Cass still swung his axe, and it bounced off the stones at his feet with a blade-chipping clang. The giant turned, started to raise the axe, and let out another roar, but the sound was choked off by a gout of blood. Cass looked down at the sword in his chest. Confusion painted suddenly on his face. His axe dropped from weakening fingers, and he reached for the sword, but he only pawed at it, unable to grasp it. He looked over at Jalen, whose jaw hung open in disbelief, took one step towards the Grey Wizard, and sagged bonelessly to the floor. Tiam stood slowly, his body wrapped in burning fatigue, and he walked unsteadily towards Cass. The swordsman pushed on the giant with a boot, then reached down and wrenched his sword free. He looked to Jalen, did his best to stand up straight, and gripped his sword as well as he could with his numb hand. "Have you anyone else?" Tiam said, meeting the tradition of a formal duel. Jalen only stood, staring down at the dead barbarian, mouth working but no sound coming out. When the wizard said nothing, Tiam sheathed his sword. "So be it. I claim this victory." He walked to the cage at the edge of the ring, undid the single latch, and opened the door. The girl looked up at him hopefully. "Is it done?" "It is," Tiam said, still panting. He held out his hand. "Come, I will see you home." Tiam led the girl towards the hallway, and Doran fell into step beside him. "I would walk with you, Tiam," the mage said. "I would talk to this girl's mother." The swordsman didn't have the sand left to argue. "Aye." Smiling, the wizard clapped him on the arm. "You did a good thing here today, Tiam." Tiam shrugged. "As you say. In days like these, someone has to stand." The end. I had a good time reading that, I had a good time writing it, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks very much.